All right, it's 8:32. Paul, are you ready to go ahead and get started?
Oh,
Okay, welcome everybody to the PILSBRy TCN's imaging workshop. We have with us today Paul Callomon of ANSP, who is the collection manager of mollusks. He's worked for ANSP for about 20 years now. And is currently in his imaging room at ANSP, which was built to service, various projects and departments across the museum. And, so far they have imaged almost all of their type specimens in the mollusk collection, which is about almost 80,000 specimens. So it's, safe to say that Paul has a lot of experience imaging or taking really good photos of museum specimens. And so we're really excited to have him here. I will ask that everybody keeps their video and themselves muted. Just going to keep that off so we can keep the focus on Paul. If you do have any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat, or once we get to the end of this, feel free to unmute yourself and ask, because we will have we'll have a question and answer time at the end of this as well. If anybody has anything, feel free to message me, or if you need anything, feel free. This is recorded and will be posted online, and I will give out the link at some point in the future when I have that. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Paul now. I'm going to turn off my video and mic, and we'll go ahead and get started.
hi folks. Greetings from the imaging room, the aforementioned imaging room at the Academy of Natural Sciences here in Philadelphia. Today I'm going to give a talk that's mostly going to be a PowerPoint, and then we'll come back here, and if there are questions and things people would like to see a bit more about, we'll do that. But to start with, I'm going to share my screen and give you a bit of a PowerPoint. So I'm sort of hoping that everybody can see this. We practiced this earlier on, but that means nothing usually. So anyway, I'm assuming that you're all seeing this.
And you're good to go.
All right, good. So as you can see, the title of the talk is Taking a Good Picture. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. So first of all, what is macro photography? It's actually it's a bit of a misnomer. It should refer to a photograph where the thing that you're photographing actually is bigger on the film than it is in real life. But mostly nowadays, macro photography simply means photographing small things close up, and that's the meaning that we're using today. Just a bit of shout out here. These fine organizations are backing this talk, and the three themed collection networks, the PILSBRy, the Dig-In, and the Eastern Seaboard, that the Academy is currently a participating institution in. There's also a little plug here for a publication I recently put on the web for free, a basic guide to specimen photography and museum collections. This contains a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today. So if you just Google my name, there's only 19 people on Earth that have my name. So if you just Google that and photography, that should get you to it. So we're talking about a good picture. What is a good picture? Now, we're not Henri Cartier-Bresson. We're not trying to capture the subtleties of the human experience. We're not trying to capture the mists of an early dawn in the French landscape. No, we're photographing for scientific purposes. And what that means is that as far as possible, our photograph should be a proxy for the specimen. It should be something that people working in our groups can use, and it's almost as useful to them as the actual specimen itself. So what that means is it's correctly posed, and we'll talk about that in a moment. It's sharp, it's in full focus, it has clear edges, and I'll talk about the reason for that too. It needs minimal color adjustment, and I'm going to be talking quite a bit about that part. It's archived in an editable format. So what do I mean by an editable format? Well, RAW or digital negative or TIFF, these are all image formats that preserve the individual color components of the photograph that comes out of the camera, the three channels, red, green, and blue, RGB. A TIFF, a JPEG, I beg your pardon, a JPEG is not. A JPEG is like a snapshot from a wedding. The other formats are like going back to the wedding itself. So with a TIFF or a RAW format, you can always reopen the image and edit fully the different color channels and do a lot of things that you can't do if what you have is a JPEG. So the easy way to remember it is that a JPEG is a snapshot which you use to send to other people and say, hey, look, I was at this wedding. But an image file is the actual wedding. And hopefully your image, if you can, it contains one or more white balance registers, and I'll talk briefly about that in a moment. This image technically contains 3, white, gray, and black, but I would only actually trust the gray in this one, and I will, again, say a little bit more about that. So another thing about a good picture is that it has no areas of zero data. And what I'm going to just point to here a little bit for the nerds among us is this thing called a histogram. And a histogram is a cross-section of the picture. And as you can see in the histogram of this picture, you have, there's the black is at the left and the white is at the right. And somewhere to the right of the black, there's this enormous tower that represents the black background of the image. And then this kind of mountain that's on the right-hand side of the image, that represents the shell itself. But what you can see is that at the extremes of the histogram, at the black point and the white point, there is no data, which means that all the data in the picture fall between the black and white extremes, but none of it actually touches the black and white extremes. That is to say, there is no data in that picture that is 100% black or 100% white, and that's how you want to get it if you can. If the picture has clean edges and it's well lit, you can easily separate it from its background using Photoshop or GIMP or whatever software it is you use. That means it becomes a proxy for the specimen in whatever setting you want to put it into, whether you put it on a plate with others, whether you just have it on its own as a floating image. It functions as if it were the specimen itself. And so to achieve this is much easier if the thing had sharp edges to start with. Good pictures, if you're capturing a specimen, depending on what you're photographing. So as we know, all living things are divided into 2 main groups, those that matter and those that don't. And the mollusks do, so this talk is going to be mostly about mollusks. But even if you're photographing minor things like insects or crustaceans, there are standard views, front, back, side, and so on. And you should take your pictures in those views as far as possible so that you can compare the front view of 3 different things with each other. And the problem is not that they were taken in different views. The problem is whether or not they are different from each other. Again, another plug for a publication here. This is a little booklet I put together on this subject for mollusk shells, and you can get it online free. Just Google my name and the phrase standard views. A bad picture, on the other hand, and it hurts my eyes to look at these, I actually had to really try hard to take these because taking a bad picture these days is pretty difficult, but it can be done. It's poorly posed, it's not sharp, it's not in full focus, it needs color adjustment, but most importantly, it has those areas of zero data. So the upper picture here, a lot of that white will never be recovered because it's 100% white. There's nothing you can do with it. There's no data there to recover. So when we take our pictures, where are they going? This is the same plate. The only thing that's different about it is that I've changed the background color. And what this shows you is that if you've got a good picture, it doesn't matter what background it appears on, it'll look okay. And its color will by and large work no matter what the background is. So these have all been taken as individual pictures. They were actually shot on white and then cut out using Photoshop and put into this white backgrounded plate that's in the middle. But if you put it onto black, it looks fine. If you put it onto blue, it looks fine. They're good pictures. Always shoot either on white or on black. Do not shoot on a colored background. And the reason for that is that the background inevitably reflects a little bit back up onto the shell. But if it's white or if it's black, it doesn't upset the color. Whereas if the background is blue, you're going to get a blue haze around the outside of your shell, which will be very difficult to deal with. So to get a good picture, which is what this talk is about, you have to rank in order of importance the things that you have to make and the things that you have to learn. You'll notice from this list, incidentally, that the camera is actually the least important thing. Most people would start a talk about photography with talking about cameras, but actually I'm not going to talk about cameras at all, really, except right at the end. And I'll tell you the reasons for that will become apparent. So in order of importance is the space, your working space. The bench and the stands, so the stand that's holding the camera and the bench that you're working on. The specimen mounts, which is what you're using to hold your specimen. The lighting, understanding the 3 factors of exposure, which I'll explain in a moment. Lots of practice, good lenses, and then finally the camera. So the camera room, here's the one that I'm talking to you from right now. These are ideals. Everybody's institution is different. Everybody has different space issues. But basically, if you can, try not to have any windows and try to have controlled lighting. So the lights in this room are LED strips, which we hung instead of fluorescent pipes that were there before. What I mean by controlled lighting is that you know what the color temperature of your lighting is. It's written on the unit or it's written on the tube. And we'll talk about color temperature in just a moment. Make sure there's enough space. We can have 4 people working in here at the same time. The room has its own air conditioning, so it doesn't get too stuffy. There's enough room so that people aren't banging into each other. You want good monitors. People often don't think about monitors at all. There's a monitor with their computer, so they just use that. But in a camera room, you really should spend a bit of money on some nice monitors that can be calibrated properly, because you're going to be looking at them a lot and you're going to be using them to judge whether you've got your photo right or not. So it doesn't make any sense to have a really cheap monitor if you've got a really expensive camera. And if possible, the space should be permanent. So it should always be the camera room, and it should have a manager, somebody who takes care of the equipment and who schedules who's going to be in there and just makes sure that things aren't getting broken or lost, but then who also develops the stands and the setups for particular purposes. So if someone comes to them and says, we want to photograph a whole bunch of such and such, they can, the manager can set things up so that the operator just comes in and starts work. These are ideals, and I'm pretty sure that most people won't be able to get all of these things, but if you can, great. So we start with the bench and the stands. Here's an old camera stand that I used for many years, and this is the sort that we used to cart around when we went to other people's museums. It works perfectly well. It's a little bit small. It's a little bit unsteady. This tripod I also used a lot when I was traveling around. This is very, very stable. It's a beautiful piece of kit, but unfortunately it's pretty heavy and bulky. And both of these will do you okay, but really, if you can, a setup that looks like this is a bit more like it. So you have a camera stand which slides up and down, and these can be bought new, but there's a lot of them used on the market, and they don't cost that much. The stand is screwed to the bench so it doesn't move, and that does 2 things. It holds the stand steady, but it also stops people moving your camera stands around. It helps it be a camera room. You have a fence around the foot of the camera stand, so there's that white fence there. That stops things from rolling off the camera stand and onto the floor, which can be an undesirable outcome. And then you have I have a bouncer here. The bouncer is that big white panel, which is just, it's white foam, and I put it behind the camera just to give me a little bit of fill lighting. It acts just to reflect a bit more light onto the specimen than a black wall would. And magic arms. The magic arms are what are holding up the flash heads in this photograph. These magic arms, which cost about $100 each, you can buy them from any photo supplier. These are great. Once you have them, you'll wonder how you live without them. Whatever kind of lights you're using, if you put them on magic arms, you can move them around, you can lock them in place, and suddenly things become very much easier, and you don't realize how much easier these things will make your life until you have a pair of them. So get magic arms. The specimen mounts, another plug for a publication here. I did a little publication about a particular system that we use here that holds mollusk shells, but it also holds fossils and small birds and various other things. And again, if you just Google this and my name, you'll be able to download it. On the left there is the old style nail in a block of wood with a bit of black velvet. Works perfectly well, except that you have to put a bit of clay on top of the nail. And you should try to avoid clay or adhesives because they leave deposits on your specimens, and they could also damage your specimen when you pull it out of the clay again. Lighting. So this is the next most important thing. So the basic rule is you can never have too much light. It's always easier to make light weaker than to try and make light stronger beyond what they're capable of. In other words, move them too close to the specimen. So the good news is nowadays light is abundant, cheap, and easy to set up, and it's usually not hot anymore. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Diffuse light is the best. And if you want to polarize light to get detail, to get transparency, you can always polarize it at the camera. You don't have to polarize your light anywhere else. Use nice diffuse general light that gives as few shadows as possible. So a big setup that wastes a lot of light actually gives you the best pictures. Being outside would probably give you the best of all, but that's not practicable for most people. So the key to getting those well-lit edges that we were talking about that allow you to very quickly and easily split the specimen off the background is to hold your specimen away from the background that you're shooting it on so that the background is out of focus and is nice and even. That makes it very easy for Photoshop to see it. It also, a setup like this means that the edges of your specimen are very well lit. You can use little mirrors, just little shaving mirrors or hand mirrors, to bounce a bit of light in to improve your edges. And here's an example of that. This is a snail shell that's notoriously difficult to photograph, which is why I use it for testing. And on the left, you can see that the flash heads, which are above and below the shell, have lit it well, but the edge is kind of dark and it's going to be difficult for Photoshop to separate that cleanly. So I just held a little shaving mirror alongside it while I took the picture. And as you can see on the right, we now have a nice sharp edge. Very primitive, very satisfactory. So let's talk a little bit about color and color temperature. So there's no such thing as true color. We think that things are red and things are blue and things are purple and so on. And most of the time, there's no argument about that. But what shade of red it is, what shade of blue, how deep it is, and so on, this depends on what light you are using to look at it. So we scuba divers, we know that you can have a nice bright yellow dive light, but by the time you're 15 feet down, it looks gray because the yellow waveband's being filtered out. And so the light that you're using to look at that light doesn't emit yellow anymore. So what color is it? It's actually gray. So there is no such thing as true color. There's only reference to a common standard. And for human beings, that common standard is daylight. So when you go outside during the day, the daylight temperature is somewhere between 5,500 and 6,500 degrees Kelvin. 5,500 is vertical sunlight with no clouds and the sun dead overhead. 6,500 is through clouds. Now, why is it stronger through clouds? It's because it's diffused, so it's bounced around more, and actually its color temperature is higher. So anything below these figures is warm light, so like the light of a lantern or a candle, and anything above it is cool light, like ultraviolet. So of the lighting sources that we use in photography, flash, LED panels, and some fluorescents and bulbs are within this daylight standards, 5,500 to 6,500. And that's what you should aim for with your lighting setup. So what do we use to make this light? Well, in the old days, all we had was bulbs. We had tungsten photoflood bulbs, and then there were halogen bulbs, which we used for car headlights and so on. And then there were incandescents. And most of these can be obtained in versions that are over 5,500 degrees Kelvin, especially fluorescents. They're constant, which means you turn them on, you take your picture and turn them off again, which has a big advantage that I'll talk about in a moment. They're cheap, but they often lose their color temperature as they get older. They start to get warmer. They're single point, which means that they are very specific points of light. So you do need diffusers. The problem is that they're often very hot. So fitting any sort of diffuser that's based on cloth or plastic can get tricky, because you want the diffuser to be fairly close to the bulb, but you don't want to set fire to the camera room. Flash is great. We use it a lot here. And for a very long time, this was the only serious option for macro photography. It's got great color temperature. It's very sharp. It's interesting because the flash is much, much faster than your shutter speed. Flashes can be up to 1/80,000th of a second long. If your building wobbles a bit or your camera stand wobbles a bit, using flash will actually make your pictures sharper. It's cold, so you can take as many pictures as you like and the flash heads don't get hot. It's pretty easy to set up, pretty easy to adjust. And it can, if you like, be fully automated. So the bottom left setup here, where you have two little flash heads on the end of the lens, that's actually fully automated. The camera controls the flash. But I don't see that as a plus. When it works very well. When it doesn't, it's exasperating. And it doesn't always work the way you want it to. You can waste a lot of time trying to get TTL to work well. Whereas if you just learn the basics, as we're going to go into in a moment, you don't need it. And you can save yourself quite a lot of money. Nowadays, we have these LED panels, and this is what we're gradually switching over to here as our flash units burn out, although our big fashion flashes show no signs of burning out after 30 years, which is kind of encouraging. LED panels, they have everything you want. They have good color temperature, they're easy to set up, they're constant, they can be fitted with diffusers, and so in my opinion, these are the best option for new equipment. If you're buying new stuff, this is what you should be getting. So the 3 factors of exposure, this is what we learned back in camera school in the 1960s, in the 1940s, and actually in the 1870s. Memorizing this, getting to understand this makes everything much, much easier. And with this, you don't need automatic systems. You can use any camera, you can use any lens, and you can get a good picture. So inside your lens, there is a hole, and you can make that hole bigger and smaller. It's the same as the hole in your eye. So in the middle of the day, your eyes are like pinpricks, and then late in the evening, your eyes are big and dark. It's the exact same thing. It's a hole whose diameter varies, and it's called the aperture. And the size of the aperture is called the F number. Don't ask me why. The next factor is the shutter speed. There is a shutter that opens and closes and lets light into the camera. The longer it's open, the more light gets in. With the aperture, the bigger the hole, the more light gets in. So the size of the aperture and the speed of the shutter, the opening time, are 2 ways that you can control how much light gets into the camera. The third thing you can control is the amount of light that's present in the first place. Just keep buying bigger lights, or move the lights closer to the shell, or move the lights further away. The goal is to balance these 3 things to get as much as possible of what we call depth of field, which is what I'm going to talk about next. One more thing, you can make the camera more sensitive. So there is a sensitivity adjustment on the camera, and it's usually expressed as either a DIN or an ASA number. And the higher the number, the more sensitive the camera is. So you would think, well, why not just make the camera really sensitive? And the answer is that picture quality suffers very badly once you start to speed your camera up, once you start to make your camera more sensitive. Now, these days, this is becoming less and less the case. Cameras are becoming able to function at much higher sensitivities with much less loss of picture quality, but you're going to pay a lot of money for that ability. And as I'm going to point out in a moment, you don't need it. So best to leave the sensitivity set to the default, which is usually 100 or 200 ASA or somewhere in between there. So what is depth of field? So you look at these 2 pictures. This is a thorny oyster on a piece of rock. And in the left-hand picture, which was taken through a very large aperture, a very big hole, you can see that only the rock is in focus. The shell itself is not in focus, and the stand is not in focus either. On the right-hand picture, we've made the hole in the lens very small, and now the whole shell is in focus, plus the rock, plus the stand. So the distance between the nearmost thing that is in focus and the furthermost thing that is in focus, that is what is called depth of field. And it is governed by the aperture. It's the distance between the closest and the furthest points that are in focus, and it's determined by the aperture. The smaller the hole, the more depth of field, okay? But making the aperture smaller means that you're reducing the amount of light going into the camera. So to get that amount of light back up again, you either have to slow down the shutter, so you leave the shutter open for a longer period, or you have to add more light. A slower shutter speed, incidentally, means you need a steady camera. So if your stands are a bit wobbly or building is vibrating or whatever, these are going to be problems. So to get as much depth of field as you can, you want to use the smallest aperture that you can that works with the lighting that you have. So a regular lens, its smallest aperture is usually 16 or 22. But macro lenses designed for this kind of photography, they go down to 32 or even 45. And it's one of the reasons they're expensive, because making a diaphragm that closes accurately that small is quite expensive. Depth of field, incidentally, is determined by the aperture, so it doesn't increase or decrease relative to magnification. What does that mean? It means that no matter how much magnification you're using, you'll still have the same relationship of the aperture size to the depth of field. It doesn't vary. So just to recap on that one, depth of field, the most important factor in macro photography. It's a function of how big the aperture opening is. The smaller the hole, the more depth of field you have, and you can adjust everything else to compensate for that. There is a point, though, beyond which you just don't have enough depth of field to capture the whole of your subject. And this is often the case with beetles that have long antennae, or with plants that have very long petals and so on. If that's the case, there is a technique called focus stacking. And I'm going to give a separate talk on this subject because it's easy enough to do, but we won't go into it now. Just bear in mind that there is a technique called focus stacking, which gives you effectively infinite depth of field. It's cheating, but hey. So the next important thing, the lenses. So whatever camera you use for macro photography, you should try to get one that has interchangeable lenses. You can change out the lens. Even if you don't use different lenses, even if you only ever use one lens, the fact that you can detach it from the camera means that you can put things between the lens and the camera that help you get more magnification or other effects. And so that's another good reason to have interchangeable lenses. Autofocus, it's good if you've got it, but you don't need it. And if you can learn to live without it, your life is going to get a lot cheaper. Because older lenses that don't have autofocus, they can be bargains, and they're just as good as the ones you can get today. In all cases, wherever you can, get a macro lens. Not only do they have this small aperture opening that you need, they're also set up optically so they give a very undistorted image, whereas many standard lenses, they're not as good in that regard because they're not really meant for macro photography. So here are 3 macro lenses. They're all effectively the same lens. They have the same range of magnification and the same aperture, but the longer ones will allow you to put your camera further away from your specimen, which means that your lighting is going to be easier. At high magnifications, you're not going to have the camera sitting so close to the specimen that it gets difficult to light it properly. The downside, of course, is that the longer ones are more expensive. So these 2 lenses, the middle one and the left one, are 2 versions basically of the same lens, one longer than the other. The one on the right is the same as the one in the middle, it's just 30 years older, and it's about 1/4 of the price. So the one on the right, if you can stand using manual focusing, you can get these used and in perfectly good condition for about $150. The one in the middle, new will cost you about $900. Used will cost you anywhere from $200 to $500, and the one on the left a little bit less. But the lesson here is that if you can work with manual focus, you can save yourself a lot of money. So finally, the camera. Nowadays, it's almost impossible to find a camera with interchangeable lenses that can't take a good picture in the setups that I've been talking about. Anything made in the last 10 to 15 years will be fine. There are certain things that you should look for, certain features, and make sure you've got those if you can. And those are almost all on almost all cameras now. So the first thing is that the camera should be externally controllable, because you're not, nowadays, you don't want to squint through a viewfinder. Most cameras, in fact, all cameras now have a little monitor on the back of them that you can use to see what you're doing. But those monitors are pretty small and they're not great. However, if you've got a live video feed coming out of your camera, you just hook it up to a really nice big monitor that's easy on your eyes, and that, more importantly, can be calibrated to match your room lighting so that you know that you're getting the same color on your monitor that you're going to get on your image file. You need a USB connection or an HDMI connection so that the camera can be controlled by a computer. So the computer, you can fire the shutter and change the aperture and do your autofocusing and so on from the computer, not from the camera itself. It should be compatible with software that controls cameras. Each manufacturer makes their own packages, Canon, Nikon, and so on. But you can also buy generic programs that will control cameras. So the camera doesn't have to be what was called a single lens reflex anymore, which is a camera that allows you to look through a viewfinder and look down the lens. You can actually now get what are called mirrorless cameras that simply use their own monitor as the viewfinder. As long as you can connect them to a computer and a monitor, it doesn't matter whether they have a viewfinder anymore or not. But try to standardize your system. That is to say, if your camera room used to use cameras from a particular manufacturer and you still have some lenses and some bellows and some adapters and so on, then keep using that system. And if you can, encourage other people in your institution to use the same system, the same manufacturer and the same lens mount. That way you can swap stuff with people, you can borrow stuff from other people, and over time you can build up a really nice system, even using old used stuff that people donate to you because it was their grandfather's or whatever. So here's just a picture of our standard workhorse setup, the camera pointing at the shell, our little scale bar and white balance register in there. So what is a white balance register? It's a little piece of card, in this case, that has 3 sectors. It has 2 grays and a white. And if you can include at least one of those grays and a white in your picture, that allows you then in an application like Photoshop, for example, to just tell the application, here is a standard gray, here is a standard white, and it will adjust all the colors to match. So some people put color registers in their pictures, really not necessary, as long as you've got a white balance register so that the computer understands what in that picture is a true gray. So this is sort of at the end of it. Again, a quick plug for the various projects that are sponsoring this, and you can download the basic guide, which has everything that's been in this talk and some other things. And my other 2 guides, one on making the specimen mounts and one on standard views for mollusk shells. And with that, I'm going to unshare my screen, and Chandra will take over again, I expect, and we can do some Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, Paul. I really appreciate it. I definitely learned a lot. There's a lot I don't know about photography, and I'm glad to have learned about it. So if anybody has any questions, go ahead and just throw them in the chat, or go ahead and unmute yourself and talk to Paul that way.
What I'm doing here, I'm just moving around the camera to show a couple of the other setups. This is fundamentally the same setup as we were looking at before, with 2 flash heads. The camera itself is mounted on top of a very large lens that's called a long distance microscope. These are fairly expensive, but they do a fantastic job of very high magnification macro photography. They're configurable, so you can add a diaphragm if you want, or if you don't want one, you don't have to have one. The little flexible things here, these are the modeling lights, which allow you to illuminate your specimen while you're focusing and posing. Only really useful if you're using flash, because you can't model with a flashlight. However, and this is something I didn't actually talk enough about, so I will do now. Here is the LED setup I was telling you about, with 2 LED panels with diffusers on them. So when you have constant light, like a light bulb or an LED panel, you can adjust the shutter speed to get your mixture of shutter speed and aperture right, and therefore get as much depth of field as possible. Now, with flash, you can't adjust your shutter speed. It's fixed because it has to be synchronized in order that the flash happen while the shutter is open. So with flash, you only can control the amount of light. Whereas with a constant light source, like a light bulb or an LED panel, you can control not only the amount of light, but the length of time the shutter is open. So it does make the whole setup a little bit more flexible. And given that these LED panels now don't cost any more, in fact, they cost substantially less than very high quality flashes like this, there's no reason not to switch to them.
All right, Paul, so we have a few questions for you, if that's all right.
Sure.
All right. Okay, so from Guilherme asks, Paul, do you have any recommendations more specific to micro mollusks? Is your method better than using mounted cameras on stereo microscopes?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So for really, really small stuff, I've actually made some rigs where I've mounted cameras onto regular compound microscopes. One of them is illustrated in the basic guide to photography. The golden rule with mounting cameras on microscopes is that you should try and get a straight light path. So what I mean by that is, here is a stereoscope of the kind that we're all familiar with. And I can put an eyepiece adapter here and just put a camera on there. But this goes through a prism. It bends the light path. So the quality of the image is going to be affected by that. Whereas some microscopes, they have a tube that comes straight up here and the light path is dead straight through the lens. That's always a better approach. It gives you less aberration and fewer fringe effects. But yeah, basically putting a camera onto a microscope, one of the problems is that you're not going to have you may or may not have a diaphragm, to control the aperture and get depth of field. However, if you do image stacking, and I do again in the basic guide, I go into this a little bit. If you use the microscope's fine focus control to produce an image stack, you have effectively limitless depth of field. It works very, very well. For micromollusks, this kind of long distance microscope, if you can afford it, it takes interchangeable objectives. So you can just remove the objective of one magnification and very quickly replace it with one of a higher magnification, like this. And that will, basically you can use any objective from any microscope. So you can go up to hundreds of times magnification if you want to.
Okay, and the next question is from Sylvia. She asked, what about the use of gray or neutral surfaces instead of white or black?
So yes, any gray basically is a function of white or black. So the black background that we use here, let me just get one. So this is a black foam which you can buy at any fabric shop. It's an open cell latex foam which is used for making safety feet for furniture, for example. It's soft, as I say, it's open cell, which means it absorbs light very well. And on the other side is just white card. So this is a white or black background. You could use gray. I think the only thing that I would object to about gray is that it makes it harder to get sharp edges. So always remember that when even if you send your images out just as flat images, somebody is going to have to separate the subject from the background. And so you want the contrast between the subject and the background to be as stark as possible to make it easier for a program like Photoshop to understand what is the subject and what is the background. A gray background actually reduces that somewhat.
Okay, next question is from Olivia. She asks, for multiple standardized views or angles, is it best to keep the camera mounted on the copy stand and rotate the specimen on the specimen mount? And if so, are there different types of mounts for different types of specimens, e.g. mollusks versus study skins versus skulls?
Yes and yes. You should always keep the camera mounted. There's a couple of reasons for that. If you drop a camera, it's never good. If you're taking standard views, you want your camera angles to always be the same, or at least the camera to subject angle to always be the same. It's much easier to make rotatable mounts than it is to make a rotatable camera mount. Study skins, large objects, you always have the problem that you need a lot of standoff. The camera needs to be some distance from the subject. And this is where a short macro lens actually comes in handy. So we always have a pair. All of our cameras here have a long macro lens and a short macro lens, precisely for that reason. We do occasionally take pictures of things that are very large, and so we'll just quickly swap out the long macro lens for the short one, and that allows us to basically take anything that will fit onto the stand. We also keep the same pairs of lenses for 2 cameras in this room. So we have 4 lenses, 2 pairs of 2, and they're the same. So people get used to using the same lenses, and they can interchange them as well. So you've always got one spare if someone quickly needs it. Spend the money on lenses. Cameras are cheap.
All right, next question from Sylvia. Do you include a physics scale bar?
If I knew what one was, I would include it. Tell me what a physics scale bar is.
FISIC, physic.
We include a scale bar that's based on, in our case, what's called a QP101 card, which is a card that has a scale bar on its side, and it has 18% gray, 50% gray, and absolute white. And that's all we use. There are lots of things you can use. There are color chips, for example. One of the problems with macro photography is getting them into the picture. So quite often you're at high enough magnification that all you can fit into the picture. And let me just give you an example here. Let me tour around. So here's, whoops, there we go. Try not to crash my computer. Okay, here we go. Literally crash my computer. So this picture here, for example, taken at high magnification, so all we were able to get in was the 18% gray and the white and the scale bar. And that's a tiny little piece of card, but it gives you enough, along with the black background, it gives you enough to calibrate the white balance of the picture and also to have a scale bar. I should say, I'm not a fan of scale bars as measurement tools. It's much better to include the actual measurement of the specimen that you took with a caliper or with an ocular micrometer in the file name or in metadata. Because it's not that scale bars lie, it's just that they're not all that accurate. And the bigger the magnification, the less accurate they are. That said, if you're working at really high magnifications, anything over 40 times, you can photograph what's a measured millimeter, which is a microscope slide that's engraved with a millimeter. Photograph that at the same magnification and include it with your image set, and then people can use it as a scale bar.
Okay, Stephanie asks, what brand of LED lights are you using?
Oh, goodness. These, so this is called ProMaster, but we got these through our local camera shop. And here, incidentally, is a plug for that endangered species, the camera shop. We have a wonderful camera shop nearby here that help us out a lot with recommendations of equipment, and they can get us old stuff because we use a lot of old equipment here, and they can still get us the old used stuff if that's what we want. Rather, you know, there are the online suppliers. We use those too, people like B&H and Adorama and so on. But support your local camera shop. You'll be sad when it's gone. So these ones are, this is, as I say, it's a Chinese make called ProMaster. There's lots of companies are making the LED panels. The thing to do is to look at the reviews and to make sure that the color, they do state the color temperature. These are stated as being rated at 5,800, and I tested them and they're not far off.
And then Fiorella asked, or I think we talked about this already, are any recommendation for the white balance register?
As I say, we use the QP101 card. That's the brand name.
Okay.
Get it on Amazon.
Stephanie then asks, on very white shells, we sometimes have a hard time making little features, ridges, etc. pop out. Do you have lighting setup techniques that do not flatten these contours?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that. So there's what's called bias lighting. So in this flash setup here, for example, or in the LED panel setup I just showed you, there are two heads. And you can either have both flash heads output the same amount of light, or you can have one put out more light than the other. And that will give you a shadow across your shell, and that will pick up your sculpture nicely. You can do this, in this case, you can do it by controlling the amount of light on each head. But if you wanted to, you could just stick your hand in front of one of them, or hold a piece of card in front of one of them, or whatever, just to create a shadow. But yes, bias lighting, using mirrors to bounce light into places, and using your hand or a magazine or anything like that to cut down on light in one direction in order to increase the amount of shadowing. These are the sort of things that you should be practicing and learning, and not worrying too much about how many megapixels your camera has. Basic photography techniques from the 19th century.
All right, question from Jenny. Do these camera systems also work on wet specimens? I assume specimen mounts may be different.
When you're shooting wet, which we do now and again, there are ways to do it. The main thing that we concentrate on is polarizing the light to reduce reflections. And you can do that. I do talk about polarizers in the basic manual. You can fix a polarizer on the end of your lens, and it's two sheets of glass that polarize in one direction. And as you rotate one relative to the other, you get a polarizing effect, which reduces glare from the surface of the fluid. And it also deepens your colors and gives you a bit more contrast. So yeah, you can shoot stuff wet. There are people who actually dip the lens into the fluid. There's ways you can do that. I wouldn't try it, but I've seen it done. If you experiment with a cheap lens end polarizer, I think you'll find that shooting in wet is just as easy as shooting in dry. For a mount, you can use things like glass balls or a little lucite pipe. You know, if you get some clear plastic pipe of different diameters, cut it into slices, and then form the ends of the slices into X's or into little hammocks and so on. Put those under the specimen. You can usually get it to sit the way you want it to.
Okay. And then Tawana asks, could you show a few examples of specimen stands and how you manipulate/rotate them for multiple views?
I can do, yes. So the system that I described that we made here, let me just go over to this camera. Okay, hope you can all still see and hear. Where are we? Okay, can we all still see and hear?
Yep.
Yep, okay, good. So here are variously what we call the palm tree mounts. They are made of metal. It's a piece of pipe that's been split open and spread out, and it sits on a base like this, and you can then put the specimen. Let's have a look here. What I don't have here, well, let me get a shell. Okay, here we go. Just put the specimen on there, put it into whatever view you want, turn it around. Really not difficult. It's actually, if you have something with tines that are sticking up, 3 or 4 arms that are sticking up, it's pretty easy to mount most things. The other thing that we have here is a vacuum mount. Again, the instructions for making this are all in the mount paper that I wrote. Let me just show you one of those. If I got one here. Okay, where is it? Okay, I'm going to need to go on Safari with my computer again. Here we go. So this fella here is a vacuum mount. There is a set of instructions on how to make this in the mount paper. It's connected to a vacuum pump, and it holds the specimen onto it by vacuum. And you have a series of interchangeable chucks. I'm just going to reach over here. These guys here. And you put, this is very good for micro mollusks, incidentally. You just put a chuck on the vacuum mount that has the right hole, turn on the vacuum, and that holds the specimen nice and firmly while you photograph it without any grease or clay or glue or anything like that.
Okay, and last couple of questions. Is there, from Alana, is there an ideal LED panel size for specimen work? The panels come in multiple powers / numbers of LEDs. Is there a good target for 2 panels for a stand? And is a light meter worth investing in?
Massive. The bigger the better. You can never have too much light. So get the biggest ones you can afford. They're measured in terms of lumens. I can't give a recommendation for how many minimum lumens, but when in doubt, just keep getting bigger. As long as the color temperature is okay, the more light you have, the better. All of these things, the LED panels are controllable. They usually have a remote control. Let's just see if I can quickly turn my ones on here. There you go. So I've turned them on, and then you can actually adjust the brightness, which is what I'm doing here. You see that? It's going down by remote control. And then I turn the brightness up. There you go. They really are the most amazingly useful things. What has changed so fundamentally in photography in my lifetime is that you can see the results straight away. So you can just keep shooting until you've got a good picture, not have to wait until the next day and get your films back from the laboratory to know whether or not you got a good picture, which is, you know, it's just such a step forward. So yeah, I would say get the biggest ones you can buy.
All right, that's all the questions we actually have. Again, thank you so much. I'll keep this open for another 5 minutes if anybody just kind of wants to talk. I will post the 3 links that Paul has talked about in the chat for those of you, for the people who came in a little bit late and don't have those. And again, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. And thank you again, Paul.
By the way, for those of you into camera porn, you know, who are real nerds, this is my other rig. This is a scanning electron microscope. That's what they look like now. This little thing here plugs into a household outlet. That gives you 40,000 times magnification with an uncoated specimen. So yeah, these are becoming within our reach as regular photographers.
How much was the SEM?
100 grand, $100,000, but with a lot of accessories. You can get a refurbished one for maybe 50,000. Plugs into a household outlet. Every few years, you just put it in a flight case, send it back to the factory. They completely overhaul it and they send it back to you. It's fantastic. If you're writing an NSF grant, you actually could get a scanning electron microscope in your grant, which even a few years ago would have been laughable.
So the link to the recording will be available on the iDig Bio page once we have that ready to go, and I'll try to have that done within the next day or so.
Cool. Another little feature here, by the way, if you can, mount your monitors. Don't have them sitting on desks. Put them on flexible mounts so that you can work portrait or landscape, and you can put the monitor exactly where you need it, depending on how tall you are or how you like to work. These flexible monitor arms, they're very, very cheap, and it makes your life easier. Always think about how you can make things flexible rather than rigid and bolted in place. There's the graveyard. These drawers are full of equipment that we sometimes use. Umbrella diffusers, which you can put onto your lights or put onto your flashes or your LED panels just to diffuse the light, to point them backwards and use these to spread the light out. And the latest in Soviet camera technology. All right, are we done?
Yep, I think that's it. You're getting a lot of thanks, a lot of great talks. Thank you.
Looks like you got people entering the waiting room. They may be in a different time zone. I'm not going to do it all again.
I will upload the talk link to the iDig bio page. Let me find that link for you.
The lights in here, incidentally, the ceiling lights, these are LEDs, and they're 48-inch LEDs that replace 48-inch fluorescent tubes. And you calibrate the monitor to the LED lighting, and it's absolutely perfect. It doesn't vary at all. It's really nice. You can get them at any home center.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and end this recording. And thank you, Paul, and thank you, everybody, for joining us. All right, well, I'll see you again next time. Bye.